everybody. Welcome back to the basement. We're going to continue with Flipped. We're going to jump in where we left off. Bryce's grandfather had just walked across the street and introduced himself to Julie. She was out working in the yard and she's realizing this is a bigger job than what she had originally planned on. But she felt like this was something she could do to help the family. So she wants to try to stick with it. Okay, here we go. Let's see. So, Bryce's grandfather comes across the street and says, I know we've seen each other from time to time. I'm sorry it's taken me over a year to come introduce myself. I'm Chester Duncan, Bryce's grandfather, and you, of course, are Juliana Baker. He stuck out his hand, so I took off my work glove and watched my hand completely disappear inside his as we shook. Nice to meet you, Mr. Duncan, I said, thinking that this man was way bigger than he looked from the sitting room window. Then the strangest thing happened. He pulled his own work gloves and a pair of clippers from a back pocket and said, Are you pruning all of these to the same height? Oh, well, yes, that's what I was thinking, although now I don't know. Do you think they would look better to just take them out? He shook his head and said, They're Australian tea shrubs. They'll prune up nicely. And with that, he put on his gloves and started clipping. At first, I didn't know what to say to this man. It was very strange to be getting help, but from the way he was acting, it was as though I shouldn't have thought a thing of it. Clip, 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 he went, like this was something he really enjoyed doing. Then I remembered what Bryce had said about our yard, and suddenly I knew why he was here. What's the matter? He asked, throwing his clippings into my pile. Did I cut it down too far? No. Then why the look? I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just thought you might like a little help. Well, I don't. I can do this by myself. He laughed and said, Oh, I have no doubt about that. Then he got back to clipping. You see, Juliana, I read about you in the paper. I've lived across the street from you for over a year now. It's easy to see you are a very competent person. We both worked quietly for a minute, but I found myself throwing clippings into the pile harder and harder, and before long I couldn't stand it. I just couldn't stand it. I spun on him and said, You're here because you feel bad about the eggs, aren't you? Well, our eggs are perfectly fine. We've been eating them for nearly 3 years, and none of us have gotten poisoned. Mrs. Stubby and Mrs. Helms seem to be in good health to me, too. The fact of the matter is, if you didn't want them, you should have just told me so. His hands fell to his sides, and he shook his head and said, Eggs? Poisoned? Juliana, I have no idea what you're talking about. Inside, I was so angry and hurt and embarrassed that I didn't even feel like me. I'm talking about the eggs that I have been bringing over to your house for more than 2 years. Eggs that my chickens laid that I could have sold. Eggs that your family has been throwing away. I was shouting at him, shouting at an adult, something I had never done in my entire life. His voice got very quiet. I'm sorry. I don't know about any eggs. Who did you give them to? Bryce. My throat choked closed as I said his name again. Bryce. Mr. Duncan nodded slowly and said, Well, then he went back to pruning his bush. That probably explains it. What do you mean? The boy still has a ways to go. I just stared at him, not trusting myself with the words sizzling on my tongue. Oh, he is a very handsome boy, there is no denying that, he said with a frown. Then he snapped a branch and added, the spitting image of his father. Why are you over here, Mr. Duncan? If you don't think I need the help and you're not feeling bad about the eggs, then why would you do this? Honestly, I just looked at him straight in the eye. Because you remind me of my wife. Your wife? That's right. He gave a little smile and said, Renee would have sat up in that tree with you. She would have sat there all night. And with those two sentences, my anger vanished. Really? Absolutely. She died? He nodded. And I miss her terribly. He tossed a branch into the heap and chuckled. There's nothing like a headstrong woman to make you happy to be alive. That was the last thing in the world I expected was to become friends with Bryce's grandfather. But by dinner time, I knew so much about him and his wife and the adventures that they had had together that it seemed like I'd known him for a very long time. Plus, all his stories made the work seem easy. When I went in for the night, the bushes were all pruned back, and except for the enormous heap in the center of the yard, things were already looking a whole lot better. The next day he was back, and when I smiled and said, Hi, Mr. Duncan, he smiled back and said, Call me Chet, won't you? He looked at the hammer in my hand and said, I take it we're starting on the fence today? Chet taught me how to plumb a line for the pickets, how to hold a hammer down at the end of the handle instead of choking up on it, how to calculate an adjusted spacing for the pickets, and how to use a level to get the wood exactly vertical. We worked on the fence for days, and the whole time we worked, we talked. It wasn't just about his wife either. He wanted to know about the sycamore tree and seemed to understand exactly what I meant when I told him the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. It's the way it's the way with people too. Only with people, it's sometimes that the whole is less than the sum of its parts. I thought that was pretty interesting. And the next day during school, I looked around at the people I had known since elementary school, trying to figure out if they were more or less than the sum of their parts. Chet was right. A lot of them were less. Top of the list, of course, was Shelley Stalls. To look at her, you'd think she had everything, but there's not much solid underneath her Mount Everest hair. And even though she's like a black hole sucking people in, it doesn't take them long to figure out that being friends with her requires fanning the flames of a wildfire ego. But of all of my classmates, the one person I couldn't seem to place was Bryce. Until recently, I would have said with absolute certainty that he was greater, far greater than the sum of his parts. What he did to my heart was sheer, inexplicable magic. But inexplicable was the operative word here. And as I looked across the room at him during math, I couldn't help but feeling crushed all over again about how he'd thrown out my eggs. What kind of person would do that? Then he looked my way and smiled, and my heart lurched. But I was mad at myself for it. How could I still feel this way after what he had done? I avoided him the rest of the day, but by the end of school there was a tornado inside me, tearing me up from one end to the other. I jumped on my bike and rode home faster than I ever had before. The right pedal clanked against the chain guard, and the whole bike rattled and squeaked, threatening to collapse into a pile of rusty parts. The tornado, however, was still going so strong when I skidded to a halt in our driveway, I transferred pedal power into painting power. I pried open the gallon of Navajo white my dad had bought me and started slopping paint around. We'll pick up there tomorrow. You need to start thinking about yourself. Do you want to be described as being more or less than the sum of your parts? I think most of you are more. I don't think many of you are less. Figure out what you can do to make yourself be more. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.